Welcome to the first of our special features here on the music of the Rolling Stones, 1962 to 1974. In this feature, we'll try to roll out these features one per week. So if this one goes with week one of the course, and I want to start by talking about the books that you may find helpful and some of the ones that I've used in my own research preparing material for the course and through the years. I first want to welcome you to the Institute for Popular Music here at the University of Rochester. I'm in a room that is one of our classrooms here in the college music department here, so if you happen to hear some music coming in or bleeding through, some symphonic music, that's because there are other classes going on here at the same time as we're taping this. All right, let's get right to some of the books that are the most useful, be the most useful to you as you do your own work on the music of the Rolling Stones. The two books that I have used primarily to pull together the information about Stones releases and recording and all of that kind of thing are these two right here. The book by Martin Elliott. This has been through a couple of editions. This one marked as the 50th anniversary edition, The Rolling Stones Complete Recording Sessions 1962 to 2012. What Martin has done is pulled together all of the songs. You look them up in the, whatever song you want to know about, you look up in the index, and then he has given you the chronological recording of when that song was recorded chronologically based on when the recording was begun. So sometimes something that was begun early, say like in 1963, but not finished for months later, will appear chronologically at the point where it's begun. Very, very interesting because he tends to give stories about some of the circumstances and some of the musicians who are performing on which tracks and that kind of thing. So it's a great reference. I use this one an awful lot. A second one that's also fantastic is this one by James Carnbach and Carol Bernson called It's Only Rock and Roll, The Ultimate Guide to the Rolling Stones. This one approaches the recordings in a different way. In this one, he gives you what he calls a sessionography. So in other words, he organizes it according to the various sessions that the Stones did and then lists the songs that were recorded at that time. So that's great for getting a sense of when they were in the recording studio. A lot of the songs that you find in Martin Elliott's book sort of clump together into some of the sessions that are listed in the Carnbach and Bernson books. So it's fantastic. Not only that, but he gives you a list of television appearances and tours and dates and this kinds of things, so you can really see what was going on in the Stones' career in addition to recording. So between the two of these, they're fantastic reference books. In terms of the Stones telling the story in their own words, this book, which you can see has a sticker on it because it's a kind of a remainder sort of coffee table book. I've got a couple of copies of these hanging around the house. This one's called According to the Rolling Stones, and it's probably the closest thing to if you know the Beatles anthology, where there's lots of talking to the Stones about their careers and that kind of thing, lots of great pictures. So that's a wonderful kind of account of the history of the group, although as you can see, it's a big book. So if you decide to get into this book, plan to have a very comfortable chair as you do. Another book that deals with the history of the group in a great kind of way is the Andy Babuke and Greg Prevost book called Rolling Stones Gear, All the Stones Instruments from Stage to Studio. Andy Babuke, as it turns out, is another guy who lives here in Rochester, and so I know Andy. We've had him in here at the Institute a couple of times. This happens to be an autographed copy because the local bookstore here, Andy did a book signing not too long ago when this book was released. Here, we get the story of the Rolling Stones, but told almost in parallel with the gear they were using, and me being such a gear hound, with guitars and amps and this kind of thing, that's endlessly fascinating. And so there are great pictures of sometimes the actual instruments or instruments that are very close to the ones the Stones played. So from that point of view, very, very interesting. We now can turn to some of the books that sort of are about the band in more specific kinds of ways. During the course of time during the lectures, you'll hear me referring a lot to these books by Andrew Loog Oldham, the group's first really important manager, one of the first early managers of the group. But Andrew was there during all this period in the mid-'60s where a lot of this early Stones history was unfolding. This is his most recent book called Stone Free. It's got a number of profiles of various people. Larry Parnes, Alan Klein are some of the people. The first big book was this one called Stoned, A Memoir of London in the 1960s. A fantastic book. Not only is it Andrew writing, but he's also brought together a number of other voices, other people that were there and what they had to say about those years. So it's really, I mean, it's almost too detailed in a certain kind of way, because this book I think only gets us up to about 1964, 1965. That's picked up with this book called Too Stoned, kind of the second volume of that, again, Andrew Loog Oldham. So between those three, I think there's even a fourth one you can find. Then there are the books by the about or written by the actual members or people who were in the studio with them. This book by Bill Wyman is a fantastic book, Stone Alone, the story of a rock and roll band. This is really sort of only the first half of Wyman's writing on the Stones. He's got another book called Rolling with the Stones, which is more of a kind of big coffee table book on the Stones music, and that's very interesting. But Bill Wyman, a guy who really paid a lot of attention to the detail of what was going on, he must have kept some kind of a diary, because it's amazing the kind of detailed information he has. So this one, again, together with the original book Stoned, the first one of the Andrew Loog Oldham, these two books really give you a great picture of what's happening with the Rolling Stones in those first couple years in the mid-60s, and put together with these two reference books here that I mentioned earlier, really are important resources. Of course, we have books about members of the Rolling Stones or people close to them. For example, this relatively recent book by Paul Trinka is devoted to Brian Jones, The Making of the Rolling Stones. I've had a chance to spend a lot of time with this because it's only just recently come out, but it looks like it's going to be a fantastic read, devoted to Brian, which is something that is a lot of times overlooked in some of these other books, because he really was only part of the 60s version of the group. Of course, most Rolling Stones fans will know this one. Again, one that you can find remaindered. I've got a couple copies of this around the house too. Life, the biography of Keith Richards. You get to hear Keith's take on things. Other books about members close to the group that might be interesting to you. Glyn Johns, who, as we'll talk about, starts to play a very important role in the late 60s in the recording of those Stones records, is also there at the very beginning of the Stones' career. This one, a life recording hits with the Rolling Stones, The Who, Led Zeppelin, the Eagles, Eric Clapton, and the Faces. The book called Sound Man. And again, this is another one that's just recently out, so I haven't had too much time to dig into it, but looks like it's going to be a fantastic read. And then I do mention in the first video that if there's a kind of a quick book that you want to kind of get through, that kind of gives you the story of the Rolling Stones, this Philip Norman book is a pretty good one. The Stones, his acclaimed biography. This is a used copy that I picked up around town for just a couple of dollars. I've got the hardcover back in the office here. So this is just a small sliver of the Rolling Stones books that are out there. And you notice that there's not a Mick Jagger book, because there are just so many Mick Jagger biographies out there. You can just sort of start working through them yourself. In terms of the information that's in the course, though, I have tended to rely pretty heavily on the information I get from Bill Wyman and from Andrew Loog Oldham. And these two books about the sessions and the tours and that kind of thing have just been indispensable to me as I pull together information. So these are some of the Rolling Stones books that you can find and that I found useful. In the next video, we'll talk about the DVDs that you can get that play into the history of the Rolling Stones. But for now, here's a pretty good sample of reading of what you can use to get more familiar with the music of the Rolling Stones.